Well, hey everybody, welcome back. Steven here, Northwest Small Batch Brewing. It is time for a brew talk. So today is going to go back to the early days. I just want to talk about the boil. A lot of this has to do with, I would say, new home brewers, but also, and I fall into this category of people who get stuck in their ways and think sometimes you do things, they're like, well, that's just the way it's done. And you don't really consider the fact that maybe it doesn't need to be done that way. So, cheers, salud. This is a New Belgium triple. I think it's a triple. Yeah. Anyway. Nice, good banana esters. So, the boil. Let's talk about it. So, first of all, let's talk about why, then how long, and then how short, maybe. So, the why is the most important thing. So, traditionally, you will hear that one of the reasons you would boil your wort is to concentrate it to give you a higher gravity. A lot of times you'll hear me saying that it's really beneficial to do a full volume mash. So I mean that you're using the entire amount of water you need to make that entire batch of beer all at once. You obviously need a bigger kettle to do that, to hold that amount of water. The alternative is if you have a smaller kettle, you do a small amount of water and then you have to sparge later on to bring the volume up. Totally different video for that. But the point is, you boil it down to get it to the gravity that you want. You get a higher gravity reading by boiling it down a bit. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? You could say that boiling sanitizes it, and it does. It does sanitize the wort. However, let's talk about DMS. So DMS is a compound in beer that provides an unfavorable, unpleasurable experience. And the interesting thing about DMS is it doesn't exist until you boil the wort. In other words, the very act of doing what we're doing is causing that off flavor. But you boil the wort because of all these other reasons, right? You want to concentrate to get to the right gravity reading. You want to sterilize it. You want to be able to add hops and let them boil in it for a period of time so that they can isomerize and create bitterness, or the right level of bitterness, so you get a nice balance of your malt and bitterness in there. So that's another reason why you boil. So there's all these reasons, right? Including the one of them I haven't gotten to, which is the Maillard reaction. That's where you cook something, right? The heat converts chemically the food and gives you a different flavor. So the same thing happens when you're heating up the wort and the proteins that are in it. It gives you this flavor. Now, if you do decoction, whatever, brewing, then that is even more so, because you're taking a portion of the wort out and boiling it down to maybe not a syrup, but quite a bit. You get a lot more of that Maillard reaction, and you're putting it back in. Anyway, I digress. The point is, there's lots of reasons to do this boil, but in doing so, we are creating an off flavor called DMS. Nice thing about DMS is that it boils off. It has a half-life. DMS has a half-life. And so we boil for an hour. And that gets rid of most of the DMS. Never gets rid of all of it, but most of it. So you might say, well, about raw ales, right? You don't have to boil a beer. You don't, but if you don't boil the beer, you're going to have to do some parts of it separately, right? You are not going to be, if you don't boil the beer, how are you going to get the bitterness from the hops? I suppose you could use hop oil, right? Although I think it's hard to accurately get the right amount of bitterness you want with hop oil. It's hard to calculate that. And it's maybe not the same flavor and the same thing because it's not really fresh hops. At any rate, what you have to do is make a hop tea. where you take either some of the wort or, well, probably not the wort because that's going to create DMS, probably just water, like literally a tea. And you're going to boil the hops on the stove for an hour to create a tea. And then you go back and think, well, if I'm going to boil the hops for an hour to make this, get the same amount of bitterness, then why don't I just boil it in the wort? I mean, you won't get the DMS. However, you do run the risk of, unless you can heat up the wort enough to pasteurize it but not boil it, you're going to run the risk of infections. There's definitely a higher risk of infections in raw ales compared to non. Anyway, that's off topic a little bit here. All right, so we know why we boil now, right? We know why. And then for how long? Well, tradition is that it's 60 minutes. That's your standard boil. That's enough time to boil, your DMS off. And by the way, and kudos to Clawhammer Supply for kind of finding this out, or making a note of it. One of the problems with doing an electric brewing or even on your stove is it's very hard to get the wort up to a boil. Even with the highest available voltage or whatever element, it's still difficult to get to a really good rolling boil in a 10-gallon batch with your standard US electricity. If you're doing like 240 volt, that's different. And so how do you get the DMS out? Well, they've discovered, Kyle over there at Brewing at Clawhammer has discovered that you really don't need a totally open kettle to get rid of the DMS. It just needs basically a small crack for the steam to get out, and that will allow the DMS to escape, and you won't have any off flavors. And he's right. I've never had an issue with it. He's right. So you don't need to have the kettle lid off, completely off. What he does is he cracks the lid by using the hop spider that hangs on the end, and that's just enough of a crack to allow the steam out, but gives you a decent boil as well. All right, 60 minutes, right? Well, most do. All right, so you can also do a longer boil for certain styles. If you're doing a Pilsner, let's say you're doing a lager, you may want to boil like 90 minutes. One of the biggest things you want to avoid in a lager is sulfur. Sulfur is not, even in a very small amount, it's extremely detectable and distasteful in a beer. And so a lot of times, especially with Pilsner, you're going to boil it maybe an extra half an hour just to make sure you've driven off as much possible DMS as possible. And then, of course, there is the shorter boils that have been being experimented with. Martin Keene, who is with Brewlosophy now, but he still has a channel up there, and I hope he keeps it up because it's a great resource. What did he do? So many beers in so many weeks. The Homebrew Challenge is what it's called. At any rate, he did a whole series called Short and Shoddy, which is basically I don't know if he did an overnight mash, but it was a shorter boil, like basically. And you have to adjust your hops when you do that. You have to adjust your volume of water when you do that. But you can get away with like a 30-minute boil. He does it all the time. So if that's, you got to be careful. You want to make sure it's enough time, and different styles. Like I wouldn't do a lager that way, as I was saying earlier. It won't drive off enough of the off flavors if you do such a short boil. But and of course, Dr. Hans has his versions, but his is, I think, extract, the ones that he does, the shake and brew. So that's a little different. Anyway, the point is, it used to be 60 minutes, 90 minutes, then it became 30 minutes. So it just depends on your style. And we talked about how vigorous, right? To do the boil, right? I think we covered most of it. Yeah, there's a lot more that can be said about this subject, but I don't want my videos to just drone on. So I appreciate you staying this long. If you have more to chime in the comments, go for it. I'll be back in another week, another video. Hopefully I'll have a brew day out soon. And until then, keep on brewing. Cheers.